So today I want to read again from 1 John. I read from the letter of 1 John last week. I want to continue with that today. I want to read from chapter 3, verses 16 through 24. So let us listen to the words of John. This is how we know love. Jesus laid his life down for us. And we ought to lay our lives down for our brothers and sisters. But if a person has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, and that person doesn't care, how can the love of God remain in him? Little children, let's not love with words or speech, but with action and truth. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and reassure our hearts in God's presence. Even if our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts and knows all things. Dear friends, if our hearts don't condemn us, we have confidence in relationship to God. We receive whatever we ask from Him because He keeps His commandments and do what He pleases Him. And this is His commandment, that we believe in the name of His Son, Jesus Christ, and love each other as He commanded us. The person who keeps His commandments remains in God, and God remains in him. And this is how we know that He remains in us, because of the Spirit that He has given to us. Now, what we've been doing from Easter and every Sunday since Easter is developing a theme. And the theme that we have been working on from Scripture is that Easter to a believer is not just one Sunday a year. Easter is a way that we live life. And as we look at the words of John today in 1 John chapter 3, I think we are going to continue to see how that theme develops throughout the New Testament. John lifts up three ideas that I think help us with our Easter faith. The first thing that John emphasizes in our reading today is that the cross becomes personal. The cross of Christ is personal to every believer. Let's go back and look at verse 16, our first verse. He says, "This is how we know love. Jesus laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." I mentioned last week that scholars believe that the letters and writings of John were written toward the latter part of the first century, probably in the decades of the 90s, approaching the year 100. So when you think about that, that means that John's writings were from 60 to 70 years after the cross, which means that many, if not most, of the people who first read John's writings in the early church were not even alive when Jesus was crucified. So think about that. Most of these people reading this material for the first time weren't alive when Jesus died, and yet John says in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, that Jesus laid down His life for us. He makes it personal, even to people who weren't alive when it happens. And so the cross is not just a one-time historical experience where Jesus of Nazareth was nailed to a cross. But what the New Testament is teaching and what John is saying is that the cross of Christ transcends all space and time. In other words, the cross of Christ to believers is personal and real to us right now. So Jesus laid down His life for you and me, just as He laid down His life for the people who lived 60 and 70 years after the cross, and just as He laid down His life when He was on the cross. In John chapter 15 and verse 13, Jesus makes this statement. He says, "There is no greater gift that a man can give than to lay down his life for his friends." On September the 11th, 2011, when you think about the terrorists who took over the planes and crashed the planes into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon, and another plane crashed in Pennsylvania. You think about the first responders that went into those burning buildings, firefighters and policemen. Now, some of them may have gone in thinking that they were coming back out. But we know from recordings that come from the first responders going into the towers that some of those firefighters and some of those police officers knew they weren't coming back out. But they went in anyway. And they helped other people come out knowing that they weren't going to come out. Jesus said, there's no greater gift than a man can give than to lay down his life for his friends. My dad was a combat vet in World War II. And he didn't talk a whole lot about the war. Most of those World War II vets did not. My dad did tell me a few stories. He told me about one story where he was in a very, very intense firefight. And in that firefight with the enemy, his best friend took off and moved from where my dad was to another location out in the open and drew fire from the enemy and was killed so my dad could live. And obviously my dad never got over that. He wrote that young soldier's mother a letter and said, "Your son was brave, and your son was unselfish, and your son gave his life so I could live. There's no greater gift that a man can give than to lay down his life for his friends." And John is telling us that that becomes our lifestyle, that Jesus dying on the cross becomes personal to us. And because he laid down his life, John tells us, then we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. So the first thing John emphasizes to us is that the cross becomes personal. The second thing that John emphasized to us in this reading today is he gives us a challenge to put our love into action. Notice what he says in verses 17 and 18. He says, "But if a person has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, and that person doesn't care, how can the love of God remain in him? Little children, let's not love with words or speech, but with action and truth." So what John is emphasizing to his readers is that we don't just talk about love, we do it. Love is not just something we study about out of the Bible or talk about in small group discussions or in Bible classes or what have you. Love is something you do. Now, I would imagine that every church across the land talks about love. That's pretty much a Christian topic. The question is, how much of it do we do? We do a lot of talking about it. How much doing do we do? Well, Nicole mentioned earlier in the prayer time, complimenting folks in this church for how they jump in and do. And I do think as a church, we have made a concerted effort to not just talk about it, but to do it. So this past weekend, a lot of people, well, it wasn't just this weekend, it's been weeks and weeks before. It culminated this weekend. A bunch of our people out working for Relay for Life, trying to raise money to find a cure for cancer. And what family in this room has not at some point in time been affected with cancer? So to me, those folks out there working for Relay for Life and everything that was done before that is love in action. Many of you know it, some of you may not, but when we make our offering here at Ayden Christian Church, of course the deacons receive a morning offering, and that money is used to support the ministries of the church. But you also notice during the offering time that sometimes folks will come up and they'll put money in this little jar back here. And if you're new to our church, you may wonder, well, what's this jar all about? That's called our gratitude jar. And that's a gift that somebody makes above and beyond their regular offering. Maybe something good's happened in your life. Maybe there's a praise or a blessing in your life. Maybe there's a way that you feel like God has really touched you in a special way. Well, that might move somebody then during the offering time to come up and make an extra offering and put it in this gratitude jar. I want you to know what we do with the money from the gratitude jar. Every dollar that goes in this jar is used to help the poor in this community.